Yeah, they only did one trade, right? Two trades. Oh, that's right. So they had the popsicle stick. They traded that for a Pepsi, and they traded the Pepsi for a box, an empty. Yeah, but it's a Build-A-Bear box. It's a Build-A-Bear box that had stickers and hearts. And then they went to some sleazy guy at a kiosk who was all about them, and yeah. And then he gave them that. And there you go. All right. Good job, outsiders. Now that that is officially settled. All right, guys, let's get into it. So we are in 1 Timothy. Does anybody remember where in 1 Timothy? Yeah, I'm just stalling. My Bible's not pulling up. Oh, there we go. All right, 1 Timothy chapter 1. Skipping down to verse 3. When I left for Macedonia, I urged you to stay there in Ephesus and stop those whose teaching is contrary to the truth. Don't let them waste their time in endless discussions of myths and spiritual pedigrees. These things only lead to meaningless speculations, which don't help people live a life of faith in God. The purpose of my instruction is that all believers would be filled with love that comes from a pure heart, a clear conscience, and genuine faith. But some people have missed this whole point. They have turned away from these things and spend their time in meaningless discussions. They want to be known as teachers of the law of Moses, but they don't know what they're talking about, even though they speak so confidently. We know that the law is good when used correctly. For the law was not intended for people who do what is right. It is for people who are lawless and rebellious, who are ungodly and sinful, who consider nothing sacred and defile what is holy, who kill their father or mother or commit other murders. The law is for people who are sexually immoral or who practice homosexuality or are slave traders, liars, promise breakers, or who do anything else that contradicts the wholesome teaching that comes from the glorious good news entrusted to me by our blessed God. So, a couple things. Last week, we talked about this as being what? What sort of insight is this? Yes, this is an internal memo. This isn't addressing the entire church. This is addressing Timothy. Timothy was a fellow pastor. Paul was his mentor. So this is an internal memo between two pastors about how the church is to maintain its integrity. It's not for general consumption. It's for a higher level of consumption. That said, there's a couple things that we can glean from it. And last week we talked at length about the idea of having genuine love. Now, if you recall, our subject for this year is living practically in the tension, specifically to our 5-year plan, which talks about what the difference is between God's beauty and man's beauty, and then even more specifically, what does it look like to be wise in a beautiful, godly way? And what does it look like to be mature in a beautiful, godly way? So this really hits right in the target space of what it is that we're talking about. Because here we have one leader saying, it's not enough to be a certain way. People are going to teach certain things, Timothy, but you specifically need to make sure that the right things are taught. That there's a right way and a wrong way. So last week we discussed what that right way and wrong way was. And there were the 3 specific breakdowns of things that we have for love. Specifically, that it comes from a pure heart, that it comes from a clear conscience, and that it is of genuine faith. And I left you with the thought from Romans chapter 12, which said that your love is not to have hypocrisy within it. Okay, so that is a mouthful. Today we're going to tackle this same subject, but we're going to go a little bit bigger than that. Should my notes pull up? Does anybody remember off the top what those three distinctions were when broken down in the Greek. Katharos. What did that mean? Katharos is having no guilt. Yes, that's true. Katharos is a word that specifically talks about clarity, specifically about being not innocent, not pure in its like initial state, but instead being pure due to what? Yeah, pure due to refinement, due to light passing through it. So when it says that we're supposed to have a pure heart, I believe is the first one, it's not saying that we're supposed to be innocent when we come to the table and that we're supposed to be sort of like, a baby entering the world, but in fact, that we're supposed to be mature. That we're supposed to be mature because we've allowed our heart to pass through a sacrificial state wherein we become purified. What else was there? There was the clear conscience, the idea that we lean towards what is good for somebody, as opposed to that we can just distinguish between things. That we are not only to be able to distinguish, but we're supposed to be able to lean toward what is right. And then the last one was anupokritos, which is the root word that we get the term hypocritical from, that faith is supposed to be genuine, unfeigned, undisguised, unhindered, that it adheres to the standard by which faith is a part of as opposed to itself. Remember we talked about that? That we are not to have faith in faith. You guys remember that? Like a lot of people do. I need to have faith. Getting their George Michael on. All right, so today, verse 3 gives Timothy a command. And he says in verse 3, "When I left for Macedonia, I urged you to stay there in Ephesus and stop those whose teaching is contrary to the truth." So there's a couple points that are very important in that statement. What do you think they are? I mean, no, I wouldn't say that. What we have here is a command that Timothy do something specifically. That Timothy become the uncomfortable person, that he become the outcast, that he step forward in a place where things aren't necessarily being taught correctly, and only by a few people. If you recall, Ephesus is considered a faithful church. So there's a few people who he mentions at the end of this chapter, I believe. But he tells Timothy to stop those teachings. It's very important because we live in a generation that likes to say that people are doing what they're doing and you let them do what they're doing and they have the right to do what they're doing. But that's not the case here. It's interesting. Paul tells Timothy that his responsibility as a minister, his responsibility to this church, in order to keep it pure, is to stop the teachings which are contrary. It's a command. He wants to make sure that a certain lifestyle is being promoted, a lifestyle which is faithful, right? And we talked about what the definition of faith and love is earlier, last week. So I guess the question that I have for you is, how are we committed to the truth? Do we ever think of ourselves in a place to say, stop? Do we ever put ourselves in a place where we hear something that's untrue, and when we talk about untrue, we're going to get specific about what untrue means, but you got a hint last week of what that means. Do we ever see something that's untrue and say, you know what? That is not right. And I have a responsibility to say that's not right and to ask you to stop. I think that in itself, in this day and age, that's a pretty difficult concept for people to grasp. We are supposed to promote a life that is faithful. Timothy was supposed to promote a life that was faithful. The second aspect of love, as defined just a few verses down, as we talked about last week, is that we lean towards what is right. Not that we understand what is right. Not that we just know what is right, but that we lean toward it, that we're promoting that particular lifestyle. So, again, what sort of lifestyle do we promote? What sort of lifestyle are we promoting when we watch people interact with each other? When we watch Christians interact with each other? When we watch Christians interact with non-Christians? I want to be clear, this is an internal memo for how the church is supposed to be taught. And it's speaking specifically about Christians and their responsibilities. This is not an external memo, and it's not an edict given to the world. This isn't saying that everybody is supposed to interact this way. Of course, we can infer that everybody should interact this way, but this is specific to Christians. If you believe this, this is how you will act. It's not, you don't believe this, this is how you should act. You guys understand that? So I'm not saying to the person walking down the street, I'm not going out and saying to the person walking down the street who is not a believer, why aren't you acting this way? Because they're not a believer. They do not claim to follow Christ. And so because they do not claim to follow Christ, why would I hold them accountable to that standard? A person must be convinced in their own mind about the validity of what it is that they believe. If they're not convinced of it, then why are we wasting time with telling them how they should live their lives? That's why, for instance, on the very extreme side, the Westboro Baptist Church doesn't make a lot of sense. Why? Because they're trying to convict people of something that they don't believe in the first place. It's not the responsibility of the believer to convict people. That's the responsibility of the Holy Spirit. But to those of us who do believe, the moment you profess faith, there is a responsibility to uphold it. There is a responsibility for us to have a clarity of love which is purified through sacrifice. There's a responsibility for us to lean in the direction of what is right, and there's a responsibility to be genuine, or rather, not hypocritical in our love. So, what does that lead us to? That leads us to a picture of discipline. What I'm saying is that it's not enough for us to simply love. We have to love in a specific way. The only way that you are specific with your actions is if you are disciplined. What is discipline? I know the people in this church know what discipline is. And I'm not talking about the difference between punishment and discipline, although that would definitely help to give us an idea of what it is. I'm talking about discipline. What is it to be disciplined? I can believe that outside this church, maybe if I ask that question, people are going to be like, that's when your mommy or daddy spanks you. That's not what we're talking about here, and we all know that. So what are we talking about? Maybe I do need to teach you that. Good. Discipline at its core is first an acceptance of a specific truth. Then once that acceptance happens, then it's an adherence to that truth. So it means I understand that there is a right path and that I am going to do things that push me on to that right path. Everybody get that? So, up until Christ, what was the primary form of discipline? The law. So the law was the primary form of discipline. As we know from the writings of Paul, even how Christ fulfills the law, we understand that the law itself is not who God is. The law itself is a form of keeping us on the right path. What does the law do? The law establishes the spirit in real time and real space. So we have the spirit of something. Don't cross the street because you might get killed if you don't, look both ways and you don't have a parent. And so we tell a child, don't cross the street. Right? Are we really saying don't cross the street? And if they adhere to the law of don't cross the street for their entire life, what happens? They never go anywhere, right? It would be easy, and certainly is something that happens a lot, for us to maintain the law as being the same thing as the spirit of the law. But the real issue here is safety, right? The issue here is that there's a big world that is not safe unless you can operate within it correctly. And so once we recognize that we can operate within it in a safe way, it's okay to cross the street, right? But what happened is that people were more about the adherence to the law than they were about the spirit of the law. And so we have the law itself. Does that then make the law bad? No. According to Paul, the law is good. What's it good for, though? It is good for discipline. The law is good to put people back onto the standard. So Paul gives this long list of things that people need to be disciplined in. And whether you agree with that list or not doesn't really matter. The reality of it is that those actions in that list are examples of undisciplined human nature. That's what they are. The scripture is very clear that if you are to live by the Spirit, if you are to live by who you are meant to be, the law is not necessary for that. The law is good, but that applies to people who are undisciplined. If you are disciplined, you don't have to live by the law. You don't have to constantly refer to a list of rules and say, now wait a second, I got to check my day and make sure that I hit my schedule, because you just live that way. Because what you care about is being genuine, because you've gone through sacrifice, because you lean in the right direction. There's no hypocrisy in your faith, because your standard of faith isn't placed on faith itself, but is placed on God. So, what was happening was these people were teaching that the standard that their faith was supposed to be placed in was to be placed on the law. Not on God, but the law. In this day and age, we like to move that standard to the polar opposite direction, which is to place it on what? Self. We like to say that the standard is self. That as long as I adhere to myself, then I'm good. But the problem is that the number one rule for self is that self seeks for itself. Why is that a problem? What? A small world. Yep. Self seeks for itself. Self is lazy. Self likes to not have what? Struggle. And what is the first rule of understanding how we are to love genuinely? Yes, that we are to be sacrificial in our love. That the purity of us, the innocence of us, isn't innocent because we haven't experienced anything, but in fact, it's because we've experienced everything. And because we've experienced everything, in a spirit of sacrifice, we have become pure. Self doesn't do that. When people seek only for themselves, they become lazy. They are the definition of undisciplined. They're the picture of Cartman asking his mom to get him a Hot Pocket. You guys know what I'm talking about? South Park. He's like downstairs and he's getting fatter and fatter because he's playing this video game, and he's yelling at his mom, "Mom, give me a Hot Pocket!" When you take a look at a kid who has no discipline, what do they look like? They look like that. Hopefully they don't physically look like that, but a lot of them do. Because they are not disciplined. They are allowing another person to be disciplined for them. We call that enablers. We call them enablers or enabling. Those people make up the difference for what that child wasn't doing on their own. And that child eventually gets diabetes. You know? That child eventually becomes unable. They are not pro-social. And eventually they can't interact with society. Maybe they even, develop maladaptive behaviors. They become degenerate. They're undisciplined. What are we promoting? Well, here's what I can tell you. Timothy was told by Paul that this is an issue. It was an internal memo. We are to stop those who promote things that are undisciplined and who put that into the realm of the law. So just because a person comes up and says, well, this is the way you do it, that doesn't mean that it's good for them because they figured out their way. It means that that's a threat. It's not only a threat to the way that we live, but it's a threat to who they are as a person. We are to stop those who promote something otherwise. Our speech is to be controlled. Right? That is what the scriptures say. That is what Timothy is being told by Paul, that these people are saying things they're not supposed to say. Specifically, what are they doing? What are they doing with their speech, with their so-called faith? What? I'm sure that there's an aspect of that. The term that Paul uses twice is they're involved in meaningless discussions. So in this case, they're involved with meaningless discussions about genealogy. They're involved with meaningless discussions about the law. They're involved with meaningless discussions about how to make themselves better. How to show that they're more connected to Christ through this or that. How to show that because of this genealogy, they are in a better spot in their faith. They're talking about how they are followers of the law, but they're actually undisciplined and don't really follow the law. They're not controlling their tongue. Their tongues are undisciplined. We've talked at length about how important it is to be disciplined in the tongue. How it is that God himself formed the universe by speaking. Even people who are not Christians, even people who are esoteric in nature and mystical in their thought process, understand the validity of the tongue. Even other religions, talk about being careful about how you speak. Even demonology talks about how it's important what you say. But Christians, just because they're saved, have a tendency to be worthless in how they speak. We are not to allow that type of speech. We are not to allow meaningless discussions. Those meaningless discussions result in less than Christians. Worse than that, worse than having Christians who are not up to the standard, they show Christ to not be who he is. Christ was not meaningless in what he talked about. We are to be genuine in our faith. We are to be filled with love. Let me just add another point back to speech. The difference between somebody who The difference between people who are involved with meaningless discussions is the issue of if. It's the issue of if. What is if? It's a preposition. A person who understands how they should be living, a person who understands the truth of the situation, does not say, what if? They say, what is? Do you understand? Now, I'm not talking about imagination here. Because people who have imagination are much different than people who pipe dream. Do you know what I mean by that? You look at people who have meaningless discussions, who sit around and talk about, I'm going to do this with my life. And when I get that $300, I'm going to do this. I'm going to buy a box of donuts with my $30. Those are what-if statements. They have no validity. They're pipe dreams. And that person is probably never going to fulfill that dream. And everybody knows, everybody in their life knows of a person, maybe it's a relative or an employee or somebody who, here they go again, they're going to talk about what they're going to achieve if this one thing just happens to them. And when they talk about this one thing happening to them, what are they really talking about? They're talking about getting that golden ticket. They're talking about that golden egg, you know, Jack and the Beanstalk. They're talking about winning the lottery. They're talking about something happening to them, not them happening to something. People who plan, people who have skills, and skills are developed by what? Discipline, are people who are not talking about what if. It may seem like they're talking about what if, but they're not. What they're doing is they're planning. They're saying, here's what I can do, and what I can do leads to this. Those are people who can make something happen. That's not the same thing as saying what if and then waiting for it to happen to you. That's the difference. Meaningless discussion is people who say what if rather than what is. Christians should not be involved in meaningless discussions. We are to be talking about what is. And if that means what is brings us to future plans, then that's fine. What's a good example of that in the news? I'm thinking of Creflo Dollar. He just got a multi-million-dollar jet from his congregation because he proposed, what if? What if I could just get from place to place quickly enough? Well, that would be doing God's work, wouldn't it? So he has multiple people sending him $300 at a time. What if everybody just gave $300? I guarantee you that there's a disparity there. A disparity in the way that he lives, a disparity in the way that his congregation lives. Here's a question. What if you took multi-million-dollar jet, cashed it out, and then made sure there was no disparity in your congregation? That's something you could do. That's what is. But people trying to figure out how they're going to get $300 to give to a pastor who has no mission except for the idea that maybe one day he can get from point A to point B in luxury and style, that's meaningless. And we are not to allow that. We are not to allow that within our church. We are not to allow that amongst the churches. We're not to treat each other that way. Because what happens is a disparity. There's not to be a disparity between us. There is to be order. There is to be discipline. There is to be love. Love that leans in the direction of what is right. In other words, a member of my congregation doesn't have $300. Why am I asking them for $300 that they don't have? That's not good for them. Our understanding of the law is that it's good, but we need to understand that the law is limited. The law is not good when it does not produce genuine faith or love. The Pharisees, they were teachers of the law. They understood the law. Yet Christ calls them whitewashed sepulchres. In other words, tombs that were dirty on the inside but painted on the outside to look new so that they could be sold at a higher price. Just because somebody knows the law and adheres to the law doesn't mean that their intentions, that the spirit that they're living by is pure. Because the outside may look shiny, but the inside is rotten. That's why we don't discipline ourselves by the law. That's why we discipline ourselves by the truth that creates the law. And what is that truth again? A love that is pure, a conscience that is clear, that leans to what is right, a faith that is without hypocrisy. All of those founded in Christ and what he did for us. The law is not good when it doesn't produce genuine faith or love, when it lacks the spirit that created it. Believers don't need the law. There it is. I said it. You tell me that I live in the 1950s. You tell me that I can't dance. It's not true. Believers don't need the law. I am a Jew. You tell me I can't eat pork. It's not true. Believers don't need the law. Why is that? Because believers innately follow the Spirit which created the law. You cannot be a believer without professing Christ. You cannot profess Christ without having the Spirit. You are to follow the Spirit of God, not the law. The law's purpose is to point us in that direction. Once we're there, it would be like I have a parent, and that parent has a guardian that has been watching over me, and I go to the parent, and then I'm like, no, I'm not going to be with the parent. I want to be with the guardian that was watching me. At that point, the guardian becomes bad, right? You go with the parent when you have the parent. Believers don't need the law. They innately follow what is good. But is that to say that we should not be disciplined? Of course not. We need to be disciplined, not by the law, but by the Spirit. We are to be disciplined not by the law, but by the Spirit. But here's the catch. What is it that produces the law? What produces the law? The Spirit. So therefore, if you are living by the Spirit, what will you produce? The law. Innately, you will follow the law, except for you won't be following the law. That is how Christ was able to fulfill the law, because he wasn't interested in following the law. He was interested in following God. And because he followed God, the law just came out of him. That's why he didn't sin. He didn't follow the law. Those people who follow the law, they sin, because the law is good. It's good for those who sin. That's exactly what he says to Timothy. The law is good for those who sin. So, we need to be disciplined not by the law, but by the Spirit which produces the law. The question is, what spirit are you promoting in your interaction with others? What spirit are you promoting? Are you trying to follow the letter of the law? Do you think it's important that people follow the letter of the law? Do you think it's important that people just know, hey, you walked a little too close to that line, and I just want you to know that could be sinning? See, it is important for us to say, this is a touchy area. This is touchy for me. And so I could see it being touchy for you. And I just want to let you know, I could see this being bad, and I care about you. That's really different than saying, you might break that law. Or, hey, here's something you've been doing that you don't know violates the law. So guess what? I'm going to let you know that you violated the law. Because at that point, what happens to that person? They become guilty. And when they become guilty, they are not acting in faith. And whatever is not from faith is a what? Is a sin. So now what have you done? You've made a person sin. They didn't realize they were doing anything wrong. You made them sin because you were living by the law rather than the Spirit. We need to be very, very careful about how we're interacting with each other and about whether we're thinking about things in the terms of love, whether we're leaning towards what's right, not right by our own standard, but right by God's standard, whether we're coming from a place of sacrifice. Pharisees weren't willing to sacrifice. Were they? What did they not want to sacrifice when Christ popped onto the scene? They didn't want to sacrifice their power. They didn't want to sacrifice their base of power, which was the law. They claimed to be loving, but what were they willing to do? They were willing to kill. Not only were they willing to kill, but they were willing to kill God. Yet they were following the law. So, what spirit are you promoting? And then, another question for you. What are you disciplined in? It's not enough to promote something. It isn't. Because lots of people say, I've got faith, and I've got love. And even those people are even genuine. They really mean it. But what good does that do at the end of the day if they can't actually build what it is they're saying? I believe in family. Blood is more important than water. Blood is more important than anything. And these people really, really believe it. And hey, they may even have a Christian background. They may even have a consensus of Christianity. I want my family to be raised in the church, and I believe in God, and praise America. But then when you look at their family, what have they built? Why? Why is it possible to have faith in something, but also possible for that to not create anything? Because those people are involved in meaningless discussions. Because they're more thinking about what if rather than thinking about what is. What is Christ. Christ is. He is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. If there's anything that is in the universe more is than Christ, I don't know what it would be. That's why the name that God chose for himself to reveal to Moses, when Moses asked, I'm supposed to say this to the Pharaoh? And what power am I supposed to say this by? When the Pharaoh says, yeah, right, I'm going to let your people go. Who says I should let your people go? What power should I say this by? God says, you tell him, my name is I am who I am. There's nothing that is a bigger authority in the universe than me. And Christ was crucified mainly because he pissed people off over, a period of time, but because he said that one phrase to the Pharisees. He said, before Abraham was, I am. And then they tore their clothes because they knew what he was saying. And they accused him of making himself the same as God. And that's why he was killed. So, do we believe that he's the same as God? Yeah, we do. And if we do, then he is the only thing that is sacrosanct. The only thing that is holy in the history of man and in the future of man. And if we are to base our reality on something, it's not going to be on family, because family only goes so far. It's not going to be on our own faith, because our faith only goes so far. It's not going to be on technology, because technology only goes so far. It needs to be something that's bigger than everything. But it's not enough. It's not enough just to believe that. You have to be disciplined in it. I can say that I know karate. How many characters have we seen in a movie say that they know karate, and then they're like, oh. That doesn't mean anything. Why? Because they maybe have, they've seen some kung fu movies or whatever. James, he's seen every kung fu movie out there. Does that mean that James can claim he's a black belt? Oh, he can claim it. But it's discipline that makes you into that black belt. It's discipline that makes your knowledge wisdom. And what are we talking about this year? Wisdom and maturity in beauty. So, what are you promoting, and what are you disciplined in? Go discuss.